Welcome to the last flame of the forest. A deeply calming, historically rooted bedtime story inspired by the pagan past of Lithuania, the last pagan nation in Europe. In this 5-part narrative, you'll be guided through the quiet resistance of a people who honored the sacredness of nature, who preserved old traditions beneath the surface of changing times, and whose spirit still whispers through forests, springs, and songs. This isn't just a story. It's a tribute to memory, cultural endurance, and the quiet power of belief. The last flame of the forest, Part I. Before the cross, long before the stone cathedrals rose, and the ringing of church bells echoed across Europe, the land that would become Lithuania was covered in thick, whispering forests. These were not just trees and rivers to the people who lived there. They were sacred. Every grove, every stream, every boulder had meaning. To live was to be in constant relationship with the natural world, for it was alive and it watched. The people of this land did not build temples of stone. Their shrines were open to the sky, nestled within the arms of ancient oak groves, or at the foot of quiet hills. Fires burned there night and day, flames never allowed to go out, tended by those who dedicated their lives to the old ways. These fires were not for warmth or cooking. They were symbols of life itself, and to let them die was to risk the favor of the gods. These gods were not distant or abstract. They were forces of nature and spirit. Thunder was not merely a storm. It was the voice of a higher power. The sun, which warmed the soil and gave light to the crops, was revered with morning songs and offerings. When rivers flooded or game disappeared from the forests, people sought the cause not in misfortune, but in imbalance. Balance was everything, with nature, with each other, and with the unseen world. Daily life was shaped by this spiritual awareness. Before a tree was cut down, a prayer was whispered. Before a hunt, offerings were made. In return, the forest provided berries, game, herbs for healing, and wood for homes. Life was hard, but it was deeply rooted in rhythm. The turn of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the flow of rivers. These were not just natural cycles. They were sacred texts written into the land itself. Elders and spiritual guides, often living apart from the villagers, served as interpreters of the will of the gods. They watched the flight of birds, the growth of sacred plants, and the patterns in fire and water. From these signs, they drew meaning. The people did not question them lightly, for these guides were believed to walk between worlds, part of this earth and part of something older and more mysterious. There was no single holy book, no written doctrine. Wisdom was passed from mouth to ear, story to story, across generations. Songs were sung in the evenings, not just to entertain, but to remember, to hold on to the teachings of ancestors, to recall which spirits guarded which rivers, which stars foretold a good harvest, and which dreams warned of danger. Despite its lack of written records, the spiritual system of this land was not primitive. It was rich, layered, and deeply integrated into social life. Weddings were not just unions between people, but between families, lands, and spirits. Death was not an end, but a transformation, and the dead were honored not with grief alone, but with meals, toasts, and fires lit in their memory. In this world, power was not measured by the size of armies or the wealth of kingdoms. At least not yet. Power came from harmony with the gods, with the seasons, with the community. And it was in this harmony that the people of this northern land found strength. A quiet, rooted strength that allowed them to hold to their ways longer than any other place in Europe. But change was coming. Beyond the forests, beyond the rivers, the rest of the continent had already shifted. Kingdoms had risen under new faiths, carrying with them not only new beliefs, but new ambitions. For the moment, though, in the deep stillness of the groves, the old fire still burned. The cross casts its shadow. By the 12th century, much of Europe had been reshaped by a single force, the Christian Church. From Rome to the British Isles, from the cold fjords of the north to the sunlit cities of the south, stone churches rose where groves once stood. Priests walked roads that had once been trodden by traders and travelers, now carrying not goods, but doctrines. Kings pledged their loyalty not only to earthly realms, but to the authority of the Church. And in return, they gained divine legitimacy. But east of the rivers that marked the edge of the known Christian world, a great forested expanse still stood apart. Here, the old beliefs were not fading echoes. They were living, breathing truths. The people of these lands had heard of the new faith. They had seen the missionaries come and go, often met with polite silence or firm rejection. Converts were few. The grove fires still burned, and the sun still rose to the same songs. This defiance became increasingly intolerable to those outside. The Church, backed by growing military orders, viewed the continued presence of paganism not just as a spiritual concern, but as a political challenge. If these lands would not convert peacefully, they would be converted by the sword. Thus began a campaign that was not only about religion, but about territory, wealth, and influence. Military orders, sworn to both faith and conquest, moved toward the Baltic frontier. Among them were groups that would become infamous for their relentless pressure on the last pagans of Europe. Fortresses were built close to the edges of pagan lands, not only for defense, but for intimidation and control. Still, the people of the forests did not surrender. Their resistance was not always organized in the way foreign knights expected. It was shaped by the terrain. Ambushes in dense woods, sudden raids across frozen rivers, and knowledge of hidden paths that outsiders could never navigate. What the forest folk lacked in armor, they made up for in endurance. Familiarity with the land and unshakable connection to it. Conversion was not just a matter of belief. It required the abandonment of entire systems of meaning. The sacred trees would need to be cut down. The rituals, once shared by whole communities, would be outlawed. Children would be baptized into a new order, and the old songs, those that carried memory and identity, would be replaced by chants in a foreign tongue. Many resisted for precisely this reason. To accept the cross was to sever ties with ancestors, to let the old gods fall silent, and to let the rhythms of nature be replaced by laws written far away. It was not a decision made lightly, and yet the pressure grew. The campaigns intensified. Some leaders, seeing the direction the winds were blowing, considered conversion not out of belief, but out of strategy. By accepting the new faith, they could gain powerful allies, avoid destruction, and perhaps even preserve their authority. But among the people, especially in rural areas and deep forests, resistance remained. Even as foreign missionaries arrived with books and holy water, there were still fires tended in oak groves at night. Even as crosses were raised in new settlements, some hands still carved symbols into wooden amulets, hiding them beneath their clothes. Even as laws were passed forbidding the worship of old gods, stories about them were whispered in households, passed from grandmother to child. In truth, the conversion was not a single moment. It was a slow, uneven process that took generations. Some accepted, others pretended. Some fought, others fled. The forest remained stubborn and watchful, but the balance was shifting. The last strongholds of the old ways were becoming isolated. Roads were being carved where there had only been paths. With each passing year, the outside world pressed further in. The fires still burned, but fewer hands remained to keep them lit. Between fire and throne, as the 13th century waned, the struggle between the old and the new became a question of survival. Not just for a belief system, but for a people and their way of life. The pressure to convert was no longer carried by words alone. It arrived with armored riders, fortified outposts, and new alliances. The choice became stark: adapt, resist, or vanish. Leaders of the pagan land were caught in a bind. On one hand, they were expected to protect their traditions and their people. On the other, the growing military and political weight of Christian Europe could not be ignored. Neighboring territories had already been overtaken or converted. Isolation was no longer a defense. It was a vulnerability. Some leaders began to experiment with diplomacy. They entertained envoys, received gifts, and even accepted symbolic baptisms to stall or redirect the attention of their enemies. But within their own borders, they remained cautious. The people had not changed. The groves were still visited. The songs were still sung. To enforce a full conversion would risk rebellion from within, the kind that no foreign army could cause. Yet, resistance was costly. The borderlands were under constant threat. Skirmishes became common. Villages were burned, and sacred sites desecrated. Even those who had never lifted a weapon found themselves surrounded by conflict. Over time, the desire for stability, for peace, began to erode the will to hold the old line. What remained strong was memory. Even as change crept in, the people remembered. They remembered the stories of gods who shaped the rivers. They remembered ancestors buried beneath trees, older than any church. They remembered the rituals that marked life's passages: birth, love, death, with meaning no foreign sermon could replace. The turning point came not from the people, but from a strategic decision, surrounded on all sides by Christian powers. One key ruler made the choice to formally accept baptism. It was not the end of belief in the old ways, but it was the beginning of a new political identity. With the cross now worn on shields and banners, the land gained legitimacy in the eyes of Europe, and with it came treaties, recognition, and breathing space. But inside the forests, the old fires flickered. They were not extinguished at once. In some villages, the conversion was a matter of paper and politics. Life continued as it always had. In others, pressure was more direct, and sacred groves were cut. Their trees used to build churches on the very ground once considered holy. Resistance did not vanish. It became quieter, hidden. People found ways to merge the old and the new. They gave new names to old rituals. They honored saints in ways that resembled the worship of their former gods. A festival once held for the sun might now be held for a Christian feast. But the date, the dances, the bonfire, these remained unchanged. This blending allowed memory to survive. For all the force used to impose change, belief is not so easily uprooted. In the silence of the forest, when the night wind moved through the trees, some still whispered prayers meant for ears long unseen. They may have gone to the church on Sunday, but they still offered grain to the land before sowing. They still taught their children the meaning of stones and stars in the quiet hours when no one else was listening. It is here, in this space between fire and throne, that the last light of the pagan world endured, not in defiance, but in persistence. Echoes beneath the surface as generations passed. The outer shape of the land changed. Churches multiplied. Roads connected villages that had once stood apart. Foreign merchants arrived, bringing goods, news, and ideas. Education shifted toward the teachings of the new faith, and written records began to replace oral memory. Yet, beneath these visible changes, something older lingered, not in open defiance, but in habits, in phrases, in the rhythm of life that still followed the seasons more than the calendar. The forests, though less vast than before, still held secrets. There were places where people avoided cutting trees, not because of law, but because of quiet superstition. Springs were still approached with reverence and offerings. Flowers, coins, bits of bread were still left by their edges. No one spoke of it directly, but the gesture remained. The church noticed this. It issued warnings, held sermons, and sent officials to investigate what they called hidden heathenism. But the people did not see it that way. To them, these acts were not rebellion. They were tradition. What had once been called sacred was not easily erased. Even when its meaning faded, the gesture itself held power. a hand raised to the sky at dawn, a stone left on a hill, a fire lit on a solstice night. In fact, some religious figures began to adapt. They allowed certain festivals to continue, only under different names. They permitted music, dances, even bonfires, so long as a prayer to the Christian God was included. This blending created a unique cultural identity. Not entirely pagan, not entirely Christian, but something in between. A memory layered beneath doctrine. Over time, the stories of the old gods became folk tales. Their names were spoken less, their deeds exaggerated or softened, but they were not forgotten. The thunder god, once feared and praised, became a figure of local legend. Fierce but fair, the sun goddess, once honored at dawn, became a maiden in a story, walking through fields with golden hair. These stories survived because they were no longer threatening. They had become part of the cultural soil. And even deeper than stories were the customs, ways of planting, ways of mourning, ways of greeting the land and the sky. These did not require belief to endure. They required only repetition. A child mimicking their grandmother. A traveler performing a small rite at a crossroads, not because they believed, but because that's what you do. The old ways, stripped of names and doctrines, became something more resilient instinct. By the early modern era, few would have openly identified as followers of the ancient beliefs. And yet, ask any elder in a village how to ensure a good harvest, or how to calm a sick child, and their answer would reveal a thread leading far into the past. To a time before the cross, when the world was alive with spirit, and meaning was drawn from the wind, the earth, and the sky. It is easy to imagine that the pagan world vanished, that it was stamped out and forgotten. But history is rarely so clean. What was once sacred became familiar. What was once forbidden became habit. And what was once outlawed, in time, became part of identity, hidden in plain sight. The last flame of the forest may have dimmed, but its warmth remains, in memory, in language, and in the silent acts that connect today to a world that never truly died. The roots that remain centuries past. Kings rose and fell. Borders shifted like wind, blown sand. The world modernized, and with it came new systems, new ideologies, new powers. Stone churches gave way to factories. Forests thinned for fields and railways. And traditions were challenged by progress. Yet in the quiet corners, away from the loudness of cities and the march of history, the echo of an older world remained. It remained in lullabies sung without understanding their origin, in carvings on doorways meant to keep harm away, in the gathering of herbs on midsummer mornings. These were not acts of rebellion. They were threads of continuity, stretched across time. By now, most no longer remembered the names of the forest gods. The rituals had changed. The great oak groves had dwindled, but the sensibility, the reverence for the land, the belief in balance, the connection to what cannot be seen but can be felt, endured. What had begun as resistance had become memory. and memory had become culture. It is easy to forget that history is not only made of battles and kings, of treaties and temples. It is also made of the silent choices, passed down from mother to child, of habits preserved without question, of stories told by firelight on winter nights. In those stories, the old world lives. Perhaps, in some village surrounded by misty woods, a grandmother still leaves honey near a tree on the longest night of the year. She says it is for the animals, but she smiles when she says it. Perhaps a boy, walking alone at dusk, avoids a certain path because he was told not to go there. Not because of any real danger, but because it's just not right. These are not coincidences. They are the final glimmers of something vast and sacred. The last flame of the forest was never fully extinguished. It flickered low, yes. It retreated from the eyes of the powerful. But in doing so, it hid in the safest place possible, the hearts of the people. And as long as there is breath and memory and silence under the trees, that flame endures, not as fire, but as warmth